Good morning. Welcome to Ron's Ramblings. This will be number 5 in our series. A few days ago I was reading the book of Hebrews, and I had just finished reading chapter 11. I stopped and just contemplated what I just read. My first thought after reading chapter 11 was that would be a terrific outline for the next few episodes of Ron's Ramblings. That chapter is often referred to as the roll call of the faithful, and what could be a better topic to discuss than that? And also added to that, over the past 60 years or so, I probably have taught classes in which every one of those people mentioned in chapter 11 have been discussed. So I probably have all the background information that I needed. It was just a matter of locating it, getting it out, polishing up it a little bit, and getting started with it. So with that decided, I determined the first person that we'd be looking at, since he is the first person in that list, is Abel. And then I thought, Abel is not a good place to start. There are so many important things about his birth and about his brothers and his sisters and even his parents that are seldom discussed, or if they are discussed, they're just lightly discussed. So I couldn't just begin with Abel. If I did, it would be more like a children's story that's ignored controversial material. Speaking as a teacher, I know many of you who are listening to these ramblings are teachers. You realize that we seldom like to discuss controversial material. We sometimes gloss over it, if you don't mind that phrase, and continue on somewhat like some of the stories that adults tell their children. More often, like children's Bible stories, when we get to some controversial material, we mention a few things about it and then go on. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying. As a young boy, I relished the stories that my parents and my grandparents would tell me about our family and certain family members that did some really strange things. And I never grew tired of listening to those stories. Some of them were exciting, some of them were sorrowful, but they were stories that I enjoyed listening to because they were family. During the years of World War II, I lived with my grandparents. My dad was overseas. My mom was working, trying to keep food on the table, I guess. And therefore, I spent most of my years before going to school with my grandparents. And my grandparents, my grandmother specifically, would quite often reach into her bookcase and pull out her copy of her book, Story of the Bible, and read stories to me. I suspect many of you have had those stories read to you. Maybe you've even read them to your children. As I thought about those things, I couldn't help but think about Abel, since that was on my mind. And it caused me to wonder, what must it have been like to have Adam and Eve as your parents? Very little is recorded about the lives of Cain and Abel and their brothers and sisters. So in most matters, we're left to speculation. However, the Bible does say some things. that cause us or allow us to draw conclusions about their early lives. And so I have decided to start even earlier than Abel in order to lay the background for what is to come. Because of time constraints, I realize there's much more stuff to talk about than I can talk about in 10 or 15 minutes, which is what these rambling things are supposed to be. So we'll have to divide this up into parts, a continued story, I guess. What you see on the slide that's behind me is a picture of Adam and Eve in the garden. It's actually a copy that was taken from one of the later issues of Hurlbut's Story of the Bible. And it's meant to illustrate to the children how paradise might have looked and how the animals were friendly and comfortable with mankind. Until sin entered into the world, Adam and Eve lived in paradise, as the account states, and we can only imagine what that was like. But as you know, Adam and Eve had been put out of the Garden of Eden before children were ever born to them. So their children never saw the Garden of Eden, never got to live in it, and had no idea of what they missed. We're not told how long Adam and Eve lived in the garden. I guess it didn't matter because originally their intent, or God's intent, was that they would live forever. So there was no need to worry about time at that point. And then sin came. I won't speak of the sin. Most everyone knows of the deceit that is involved. And if you would read Genesis chapter 3, it details it very concisely and accurately. And I don't think there could be any misunderstanding about what happened and what caused them to do what they did. But the consequences of that were enormous. First, there was consequence that was to be applied to the serpent. The first thing that is said about him was because he had done that, he would be cursed above all cattle and above every beast of the field. I don't know what he felt like when he heard that, but to have that curse placed on one would be very demeaning. Secondly, it says that he would be on his belly, and all the rest of his life he would be eating dust. I'm paraphrasing, you can read it on the screen. And then finally, that there would be enmity between him and the seed of woman, which would be the people. I don't know whether you've ever contemplated what the serpent may have looked like when he was in the Garden of Eden, but it says that the serpent would have his head bruised by the heel of the seed of woman, and that the serpent would bruise his heel. And that certainly takes place, as comes way later in history. But the idea of the serpent, one of the curses of the serpent was to crawl around on his belly all the rest of his life. So what must he have looked like? He must have had legs or maybe arms, I don't know what he looked like. This particular photograph is a photograph of a sculpture that was created by an artist, and he tried to depict in that photograph or in that sculpture what the serpent may have looked like, and quite frankly, that's a pretty good illustration. Obviously, there's nothing said about the serpent having his body changed other than the fact that he would have to crawl on his belly. So if you picture what you see in that sculpture and take away the legs, you pretty much have the serpent. I don't know about his size. He could have been terrifically large. We have to remember that at the time of the garden, all of the animals got along peacefully with with Adam and Eve, the inhabitants, and there was no strife in between them. So he could have been a terrifically large animal, or he could have been a particularly small one. I've always envisioned him as being large, and quite frankly, I'm very thankful that snakes don't get that big today. But that was his curse. And the consequence of that is more than just what's said to the serpent. There are consequences to Eve as well. She allowed herself to be deceived by him. And the first consequence that is mentioned to Eve is God saying, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. Reading the whole passage, it reads, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children, and thy desire shall be toward thy husband, and he shall rule over thee. It's most often thought that the consequences to Eve were that she would be subservient to her husband, of course, and that the pain of childbearing would be multiplied. And while it's true that females in the animal kingdom do not experience the pain of childbirth that humans do, that's only a small part of those consequences. So on the screen, I have broken down that entire punishment to Eve into parts. Genesis 3, verse 16 is a compound sentence, and it's composed of 3 distinct parts. I want you to pay particular attention to the conjunction that is used in part 1. I can't pronounce the Hebrew word that is translated sorrow in this passage, but the meaning is worrisome, if there is such a word, worrisomeness, if there is such a word. And it means that the nature of woman will be worrisome. Now, so part 1 says, I will greatly multiply your sorrow, that's the worrisomeness, and your conception. Now let's consider the second half of that part 1. It becomes very important after they are expelled from the Garden of Eden, because the second part talks about her conception being multiplied. That means she will bear many children. we're going to see in part 3 that he says her desire is to be to her husband and he shall rule over her, but it is that second part that becomes important, especially when they leave. And then he says, in sorrow you shall bring forth children. Now the word sorrow here in this second part is not the same as the sorrow in the first part. The Hebrew word in that first part meant worrisome. However, the Hebrew word that is translated sorrow in this second part means bodily pain and toil. So here in part 2, we have a different sorrow that Eve is going to see. And that is the pain and toil that comes with bearing a child and giving birth to a child. And she's going to bear many children. So even though that curse passes down through the ages to women universally, they all experience the pain of childbirth, the pain, bodily pain, and the toiling that it must take to get a child to be born. But in Eve's case, that was multiplied because she had many children. And we'll talk about that later. It's more than just Cain and Abel that she had. Well, also, there are consequences that must be applied in regard to the way she lived with her husband. Her desire was to be to him, but he was to rule over her. Now, I take that to mean that prior to them leaving the Garden of Eden, it was more or less an equal joining. They were helpmates to each other, as is mentioned when God created woman. Maybe not exactly totally equal in every respect, but pretty much so. And now that's taken away, and she becomes subservient to him in the fact that her husband shall rule over her. And then we come to the man. To Adam, God said, "Cursed is the ground for your sake." Reading the whole thing, he says, "Because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and hast eaten of the tree of which I commanded you not to eat. Cursed shall be the ground." I'll get it right here in a minute. "Cursed shall be the ground for thy sake. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. Thorns and thistles shall it bring forth to thee, and thou shalt eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return unto the ground. For out of the ground wast thou taken, for dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return." Obviously, it's now going to take a lot of work for Adam to provide food. Where before it was provided for them. But we see again in the curse to Adam is in part 2 that he says, "In sorrow shall you eat of it all the days of your life." There's that word again that was used twice when God spoke to Eve. It was used in part 1 of her punishment to mean worrisome. Her nature would be worrisome. It was used in part 2 of Eve's punishment to mean bodily pain, discomfort, great discomfort. And now here it is used again in God's talking to Adam. And in this case, it's the same word that is used in part 1 of Eve's punishment. That is to say, it means worrisomeness. I suspect going from the condition whereby if you are hungry, you just simply go to a tree and pick fruit from it, or pick herbs from the ground. They're there, they're edible, and they're ready to eat. No preparation is required. All it takes is just picking them. You know, there's no mention of a deep freezer in the Garden of Eden. The food didn't have to be kept and preserved because it was there on the trees. And I believe in the Garden of Eden, those trees bore their fruit constantly, not just once a year. But anyway, Adam could no longer count on that. Now he had to work for a living. Adam is going to have to worry about providing food for his family. It won't come easy. It'll take long, hard work for him to do it, because the ground is not going to be cooperative to him. There's going to be weeds and thistles and thorns that he has to work through in order to grow his crops and to produce his food. Remember, they still aren't eating meat. And Adam must do that for the rest of his life. Adam lived to be 930 years old. And he worried all the days of his life about taking care of his family. Well, our time has run out. That took longer than I expected it to, so we'll stop here and we'll begin with part 6 right at this point next time. I hope you have a good afternoon. Thank you for watching.